resources, everybody, but today is far less like definitions and technical compared to yesterday. Hopefully today is just looking at a lot of pictures, stimulating your thoughts, getting some ideas, maybe things that you've been thinking about but weren't quite sure how to go about it, or just new ideas, maybe something you hadn't even thought about. So what I want to do is start off by talking about some of the reasons why we train animals. And these are pretty obvious. We need to get access to them. Once we can get access to them, we can have some measure of control or direct their movements to facilitate our daily management, husbandry practices, just really basic kind of care and husbandry. And then of course a big one is getting voluntary cooperation by the animals to participate in their own health care, so participating in all the veterinary behaviors that we want to do. And this is obviously a huge one because vet behaviors are often so stressful and cause a lot of anxiety for animals. So coupled along with really both of these things, sometimes shifting can be stressful for an animal, but coupled along with both of these things are reducing anxiety or stress that might be associated with routine or non-routine procedures. Of course, if there's any aggression towards people, we would want to reduce that. And coupled with that, reducing aggression towards enclosure mates or conspecifics or whomever else might be the recipient of any aggression from an animal. And if there are any abnormal or stereotype behaviors, these are often considered indicators of poor welfare. And of course, we want to improve an animal's welfare, so we might want to focus in on some of those types of behaviors. And we can use training to enhance enrichment. I kind of have the mindset that training is a component of enrichment. We use training to facilitate a lot of other things, but it certainly falls under the category of occupational or cognitive enrichment. And I think it's arguable that there are times when training, although it still should be somewhat enriching, maybe if it's very routine and normal, it's not quite as enriching. I think the cognitive value of it certainly diminishes, but that's another topic. And of course, if we're using positive reinforcement training, we can present the animals to the public in a respectful manner, engage them, teach them about the animals, and overall improve the public awareness and experience. So we'll just kind of go through most of these. We're not really going to spend much time on specific techniques to reduce anxiety and stress, because that's the topic of the Lunch and Learn tomorrow, which is dealing with fear through various techniques. And I'm not going to talk a lot, really much at all, about socializing, enhancing socialization, because we have a focused discussion on socialization training techniques. So I'm going to use the time to kind of talk about the other things. And then I'll wrap up with a brief discussion on dealing with undesirable behaviors, kind of how you get animals to stop doing things you don't want them to do. So, if we can get access to them, again, sort of like I was mentioning yesterday, having animals approach the cage front or allowing us to enter their space and being comfortable and confident in that scenario. And of course, once we can do those sorts of things, we can begin to facilitate daily management and husbandry. We can get visual access to animals, do a physical exam on them. I don't know if you can actually see what the picture on the right is, but it's a ray swimming on top of a platform. So the platform put in place, the ray's taught to swim on top of it, which gives you an opportunity to get a good close look at the animal and put hands on them rather than just having them swim by. And we also will build a very trusting relationship by starting this positive reinforcement training. So this is where I'm just going to kind of go through things pretty quickly. I'm going to occasionally glance at the slides, but if there are things that you want me to describe more, just raise your hand, or something you want me to go back and talk about. Having animals reliably shifting between spaces through positive reinforcement rather than having to frighten or poke and prod them is obviously very helpful. When you have animals voluntarily moving quickly and reliably between enclosure spaces, it really allows you to provide more enrichment. Certainly an elephant that was confined in this sort of space for a long winter, which is what happened with these elephants, they would need a lot of enrichment. So being able to quickly and reliably move animals between spaces really allows you to do a lot of other things that are essential for improving animal welfare. So you can see this is quite a controlled way of having animals move. The A to B is fairly, well, it's really more of a follow with the trainer, not so much an A to a B, but nice movement from the animals, highly, highly controlled. Sometimes we may not need this measure of control. But you can see all three animals move one at a time and come and station in front of the trainer. Okay, of course we need to get access to individual animals, animals that are living in social groups. Usually it's easier to access the more dominant or bold animals. The subordinate animals within a group can be clearly more challenging to access. But we do often want to train animals to separate or at least come over away from their groups. But then it's also helpful to be able to work with a group of animals. And I will say, for those of you that are accustomed to working one-on-one with an animal, learning to work with 2 or 3 animals at a time is a really different skill set. And I think that you really broaden your experiences and skills and horizons as a trainer if you learn to work with multiple animals. It's a very different experience and kind of approach that you use. So we may be asking animals to shift from, fairly complex, large areas into small, boring, maybe they're scary if you're in a social group kind of areas. So, when we're talking about facilitating daily husbandry, think about what the animals are experiencing. I mean, fortunately here we have a lot of animals that are allowed to stay in their exhibit spaces, their bigger spaces, overnight. But a lot of facilities still shift animals off exhibit overnight. And so they may have this big, beautiful exhibit, but they're only out there from 9 till 4:30. And the rest of that time they may spend in a much smaller, more confined area. All right, so moving on to the second objective, which is getting voluntary cooperation for veterinary behaviors. What I'm actually going to do is just show you a lot of examples of things that can be trained, and not necessarily talk about how we get from A to B with those types of things. My background here is this little gorilla that I used to work with, and we moved him from the St. Louis Zoo to the Houston Zoo. I worked there a long time ago. And he had to be sedated because he was not trained to go in a crate. And this was a long time ago. It wasn't quite as common to train primates or great apes to do these sorts of things. So it was a fairly common thing to anesthetize an animal just to move it, just to stuff him in a crate, and then we have to wait for him to wake up before we can even hit the road driving from St. Louis to Houston, which is a lovely drive. So anyway, he's my background poster child for talking about the reasons why we want to train animals for voluntary cooperation in veterinary behaviors. Number one, we can reduce the need for anesthesia, which is expensive, always risky, and if we can train animals to do most of the things that we need, within reason for a veterinary exam, then we don't have to anesthetize them. Oftentimes, if an animal is not trained for these procedures, then they have to be forcefully restrained or darted or pull syringed against their will, all of these things. Certainly, if we're chasing animals around trying to net them, or the vet's trying to get a dart off on them and the animal's trying very hard to avoid that dart, it might run into a fence or somehow injure itself, so we can reduce the chance of injury for both the animal and the person. If you're trying to physically restrain and grab an animal, it's scared, you're at fairly high risk of getting bitten, scratched, or injured. And of course, focusing on stress, these situations are all pretty stressful for animals and not that great for their welfare, even though, in that moment, not that great for their welfare, even though they may need the veterinary procedure. So how do you start with this? These are scary things that we're trying to avoid or train animals to do. Well, in my experience, one of the best things you can do is, even though you want to get the blood draw and the injection trained, start with body parts. Body part presentation is you're going to need it. You need it to look at the animals, and most every other behavior requires some sort of body part presentation. And for the most part, it doesn't hurt the animals to do unless they have an injury or something like that. So body parts are a really great place to start your training. It gives you the opportunity to build skills and experience. It gives the animal the opportunity to learn about this crazy thing, you know, we're trying to get them to do. And again, sort of going back to building that strong foundation of learning for the animal and skills development for the staff. You know, one of the best ways to train many, many body parts is through the use of targets. And so the animal is learning this really important foundational behavior that leads to so many others. And like I was talking about yesterday, you learn to touch your shoulder to a target, then you learn to touch your knee. Oh, it's not that hard to touch my hip or my ear, because this concept of targeting generalizes. So just teaching body parts will kind of automatically do that for you. Okay, so I'm just gonna go through these. If you wanna stop and see something better, let me know. Just talking about all these different body parts we can train animals to do. Presenting hands and feet and legs and hooves and back feet, back flippers. There's a target actually being used for the rhino to lift his foot there. And shoulders, arms, legs. Getting access to the head and the face, the chimps having a nasal swab for culture. Eye exams, the rhino's actually been desensitized to the point where the trainer can pull the eyeball, or not pull the eyeball out, pull the eyelids open. That's something. Obviously, you'll see some implements that are in use for some of these exams. The animals would have to be desensitized to any of the implements that you see being used. Open mouth behavior. Once we get a lot of these different body parts presented, we can start to do a lot of other things. Some animals are just extremely helpful. Okay, no targeting was used for that, but it's darn cute. He likes to give us tail. Whoops. What's next? This was actually trained with some quite creative target use. This is in a lab facility. That's how the animals live in that little cage. And she was participating in an aging study wherein they were looking at hormones and where in a female cycle she was and how that affected learning, which I find a little offensive. But and they had an older set of animals and a younger set of animals to look at the differences. But one of the things that the animals had to do was to turn around, present their ventrum, and have that swabbed. So it's a vaginal swab that we're training. So most of these monkeys want to stare at you and threaten you. But you can see she's trained quite nicely to turn around and allow a really thorough vaginal swabbing. And then she turns around and threatens her. But this behavior, because the cage is quite confining and there's no way to get on any side except the front, we actually took an acrylic tube, not a tube, but an acrylic pole, a dowel, and bent it. So heated it and bent it, so we could put it in the cage, and then she learned because it was like a hook, so we could put it here and then in further and further until the animal would turn around and touch her. She actually learned to touch her nose to this target. So it was a creative use of targeting to achieve this behavior that some monkeys just want to turn around and present to you, but these macaques, especially in labs, it seems like they just want to sort of threaten you, because they're afraid. So they're always on the ready. But anyway, it was a lovely behavior that this animal was trained all with positive reinforcement to do. And the objective of the study was to only use positive reinforcement. Yes?
Did you have a problem with them attacking the acrylic? Because that's what I'm afraid with the baboons, that they eat everything.
No, I mean, they would bite it occasionally, but they didn't get a hold of it because it was coming from, the cage bottom is mesh. Right. So it was put in from our side, and that's why it had the hook, so it would kind of go in, and all this part was underneath them.
Okay.
Yeah. So, I mean, another target, it's very hard to photograph, but another target that you can use for something like that is a laser pointer. it's hard to sometimes get through the caging, and if you're doing it outside, it's really hard to use, but there are times when a laser pointer can be really effective. But yeah, I think for getting like animals like that to turn away from you, you have to get pretty creative with your targeting. So if that's something that you're working on, maybe we can brainstorm a little bit and see what ideas we have. Good job, you don't have to play now. So what I wanted to do just real quickly, and it's fun, you should want to play, is I was thinking that we could do, basically the same game that we did yesterday, where the animal's gonna leave the room, and we have a trainer, and everybody else is gonna know the behavior that the trainer is training. The animal obviously won't know until we all clap and tell you what a fabulous job you've done. But I thought we could use targets this time. So you'll have your target and a bridge. No words, no talking, but that way you can practice targeting a little bit. So does anybody want to play? Do you want to be the trainer or the animal?
I'll be the animal.
Okay. Let's see who your trainer is going to be, and then we'll ask you to lead. Okay, we'll pick you. All right. Do you have a clicker, or do you want to use whatever you want there?
I will be dead.
You can just, do you got some, everybody can give some ideas. Or I can.
Does she have a established part of her body that she needs to target train to? Like, is it her hand and face?
No.
Okay. All right.
But since we've all been talking about it, the way the game usually works is you can kind of pretend like you're establishing it on the body part that you need, and all these animals are super smart, so they can go fast.
Is it one target or two?
She has two. You can use two or one, whatever you'd like.
Like holiday years.
Using targeting. Get her to do jumping jacks.
Yeah, it's just, I just haven't seen.
Might be a little harder.
Complex.
Yes, yeah. Might be a little harder, but it's a thought.
Okay. So
Probably
probably
got to go there.
yeah, thanks. Yeah. So that's what you're in an actual aerial.
Yes.
Okay. Sit down. Do you feel like you'll need any reinforcers?
No, I can't do sugar.
Um,
I'm fine. Mercury's face. Here, 5. German would be like.
Yeah.
Use this one part.
Or tall people.
I am right.
We need longer sticks.
Close your eyes just for a sec.
Yes. Okay.
That was great. In several of the areas here at the zoo, we've been talking about having animals stay on targets as opposed to touch it and then come to get their food, or do a finger touch or a quick shoulder touch or whatever it might be. And so that's exactly what you had to deal with.
Well, I thought it was good because it's kind of what I'm trained with Dern.
Yeah.
Because I want her to stay so I can eventually, over time, go back in with her.
Yeah,
So-
exactly. But I mean, you had, like, she would do this. She was touching. And so it wasn't until you started then getting her to kind of follow the target. I mean, at first she started off still touching and dropping her hand, but then you got short bridges in, and so you kept the fluid movement, which is kind of what you do with a stay on target as well. So, and then, then you were able to transfer it to the bigger movements, which would be your stay on the target for a longer duration. So that was a great example and a good plan. What about our animal and trainer? Did you feel frustrated? You seemed like you were smiling the whole time. Maybe it was a fear grimace, but did you feel frustrated, or did you get enough reinforcement?
I think I got enough reinforcement. Yeah, it was fairly clear. Like having the shorter bridges definitely did. That was when I was like, oh, you want me to stay on the target? Okay. That.
How do I do this? More steps? Okay.
Yeah, and that helped a lot. But yeah, it was, yeah, more information is always good.
Well, if you knew anything from your training perspective.
Well, like for me, in some ways I felt like I was kind of leading her at the end there, but I know, like, the way I kind of train is sometimes I'll accept the behavior at first and then I'll get more picky. Like, especially I'm learning with Dern, who has an attention span that's really short, but this was good for me to see because it actually helps me in what I'm currently doing now, that maybe I might have to do a little bit of leading at first, and then as it starts to connect, just add more steps, if you will. So it's not, hey, hey.
Yeah, and I mean, we haven't really done a sort of shaping plan and how you train behaviors from start to finish discussion, I don't think. But maybe that's something you can do in the future, and all the different techniques you can use as you're deciding how you're going to train a new behavior, because of course there's many ways to do it. But I think that for the most part, a good rule of thumb is more steps are better than too few steps, because most animals need that opportunity to build on all of those little steps as they're progressing through. And if you see that the animal's confused or kind of given up on you or walks away or it's not worth their time, probably you need more steps. Your steps are too big and they can't kind of make that leap. So, does anybody else want to go? Have a go? This is, as we're playing the training game and kind of once you get good with your bridging skills, then we can add in the targeting parts. But if anyone else wants to give it a go, I think we have time. If not, you just have to listen to me.
I just have a question about it. Do you think if that was behavior similar to something we might want to train, would it be easier to have 2 trainers, like one on the feet and one on arms, so they could do it like simultaneously, or
Possibly, you mean for the jumping jacks specifically?
or yeah, just something about like you want them to spread their arms and legs at the same
Yeah.
time. Or, yeah.
I mean, sometimes when you have a really big animal and, maybe if you're working with mesh size that makes it hard to get your targets in and out and kind of move and go everywhere you need to, sometimes it's helpful to have a second person assist. Yeah. But sometimes you can just manage it by getting longer targets or growing a third arm or something. It'd be so convenient to be an octopus, other than having to stay in the water and only living a very short amount of time. But otherwise, it'd be great. Okay. She's cute. That's not her. She's a Jamaican. Alrighty, so obviously once we get body parts trained, then we can begin to use these body parts to achieve maybe some routine husbandry objectives, be it footwork or nail trims or feather trims.
Good girl, Brendan.
Does that animal look familiar?
Shut home. Hold, good girl. Hold. Hold. Hold.
Everybody loves a petty.
Hold. That's hold, Lulu. Hold. Hold.
Gotta give it time to dry too. All right. But really, sometimes we do actually need to do things like trim feathers, but your macaws get to fly around, right? Yeah. So awesome. All right, once we get a good open mouth, we can begin to do things like toothbrushing and taking care of any problems they might have. Good. Good girl. Always good to have a little grape juice after your toothbrushing. With some animals, we may want to train some more significant dental work, like trimming tusks on elephants or hippos. I've worked with several male hippos now that have gotten very overgrown teeth, and so we've trained them to open their mouths and allow them to be hacksawed off, which sounds just god-awful, but seems okay with them. Once you get access to the chest or back, you can begin to do stethoscope. Obviously, having access for injections allows you to do vaccination, disease testing, other things like that. A couple of injections. This is an actual injection with a chimp with a big 1.5-inch long needle, and you can see the needle plunge in and she hardly reacts at all. She also gets a whole banana, which is a big jackpot because she's a bit of a fatty, so she's gonna bite it. And then some sticking with the tiger, and you'll see she's got the needle on a pole, simulating a pole syringe, because there weren't really appropriate openings to get your hand through safely and get it back out. So we chose to train a pole syringe. And 2 sites, she just did the shoulder, and now she did the shoulder with the cap on, and this is an actual stick. Yep. All right, if an animal's trained to turn around and present their rear end, as was the case with this chimpanzee, we were able to test the efficacy of some different pinworm treatments by just doing a little tape sample and then doing the treatments and seeing what the result was, and actually found out that of the several choices of, I don't even remember what the drugs were, but of the several choices for treating pinworms, we were using one that was less effective. And because we had animals trained to do this, we could super fast, test the efficacy of these different treatments and change drugs. So that was nifty. TB testing for elephants. Elephants are quite prone to getting TB, and this guy had been exposed to TB. So the way we do testing with elephants is instill 60 cc's of saline in the trunk. They lift the trunk up and then blow the solution back into a bag. And the idea with blowing it back into the bag and with as forceful exhalation as possible is that you get anything that might be in the lungs, which is typically where MTB resides, although it can get other places in the body. And the reason I put this picture up is at some facilities for in-house use only, and I hadn't even actually thought of this. I don't know if it's possible for the Siamangs, but we've actually, on male gorillas, because they have that lovely bare chest, it's pretty easy. You can do an intradermal test on them, and voluntary without having to anesthetize them. Typically with primates, the TB test is done in the eye, and the reason is you can read it from a distance if it swells up. And that is the standard, but some facilities will allow in-house testing that's done voluntarily, and either teach the animal to turn, present their side, present their back, shave the area, or if they have a bare patch, the test can be given there, as long as the animal's trained such that you can deliver the test intradermally, and the veterinarian could palpate it to check for afterwards. So, but it's not, unfortunately, most facilities don't want to use this like for a pre-ship testing because the standard is the eyelid. Mike, have y'all trained any animals for voluntary microchip insertion? For some reason, this was a weird thing. This was at Paws. I don't know if y'all know Paws is a sanctuary that's just north of here, and elephants and cats and bears and a few primates. But for some reason, California Fish and Game wanted the elephants microchipped. Like, I guess if there was an elephant running down the streets of San Andreas, you could chase it with the reader. Oh yeah, that's Nicholas. I don't know. We didn't really quite get a clear understanding of why Fish and Game was wanting this done. But anyway, we weren't going to anesthetize the elephants, obviously, just to stick a microchip in them. So we decided to train them for it and use the skin right behind their ear. So this is training that behavior, and we kind of were like, oh, it's a giant needle. I'm not sure if we can get them to tolerate it. So this is leading up to the actual insertion, and this is I think it's a 14 gauge needle, which is a pretty big fat needle. I wouldn't want one. And so there's a trainer who's feeding and maintaining positioning of the animal, and then the person behind the ear is, we call the technician role, and that person is obviously administering the stick and bridging for what he's doing. You can hear the trainer saying steady, steady, asking the elephant to hold position. So they have it set up ahead of time who's going to be bridging for what aspects of the behavior. And then this is another one, and this elephant's really aggressive. You may see her bang her head. This is the actual microchip being inserted. I had a lot of coffee the morning I was filming it, sorry. It's a huge needle. And you can also see, for those of you who were yesterday, I pointed out that when Jeff was training Lisa for blood draw, he was kind of rubbing her ear because she likes it. This elephant's the same. You can see the target moving on her ear. Anyway, so that's voluntary insertion of microchip. And while we're on needles, this is just really, ah, whoa, I hit the wrong button. Oh, dear God. What has to happen next? Input?
Input HDMI, or one more down, there. Oh, too many, up one. HDMI 1, it's the 9XX.
I panicked.
Door. Well,
Oh, I'm doing everything wrong. There we go.
There you go. There you go.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Okay. While we're on needles, this is kind of cool. This is, that's what I this, oh, it's a little pixelated. I shouldn't make it so big. This chimp, he's a fairly old guy, and he is in a laboratory setting. He has a big facility, big group of females and other males in the group. It's a group of, I don't know, 15 or so animals. And he started losing status, and the other males were beginning to beat him up. And it seemed that his arthritis was so painful for him that just he couldn't maintain the group. So we trained him for acupuncture, which is what you see being administered. And he, within a couple of treatments, was feeling so much better and took over his group again and put those little boys back in their place and was able to maintain his group. And the strings that you see coming off the acupuncture needles are dental floss. And that way, if he does get up and walk away, which has never happened to my knowledge, then the needles just pull out and stay with us. And actually, not too long after the behavior was trained, then they began adding the infrared to the end of the needles, so it would further enhance the treatment. So he would sit there and I mean, he gets excited when he sees the acupuncture that come up, and because he knows it makes him feel better. So pretty cool stuff, really. And the trainer's like, I don't think he even really needs the banana, but we keep giving it to him because he likes the treatment so much. Okay, so along with, you know, all the other things that we want to do for diagnosing what might be wrong with an animal and checking out their health, a lot of times we want to train various sample collections like you see listed. The whale is having a stomach sample taken. Cetaceans in captivity have a lot of gastrointestinal problems, and so training them for stomach sample is an important diagnostic, and it's also relatively easy since you're not, you know, they breathe out here, so it's a straight shot, so it's relatively easy. Urine collection, I know we've trained some urine collection here. I just wanted to point out from a safety perspective, protecting the animal, protecting the people, some of the features of a blood sleeve, things you might want to think about are giving the animal the opportunity to see. So in this case, you can see there's a little window that was cut out. This was the first blood sleeve that was designed, and originally it had a solid plate and it had to fit in where the door would open, so you had to set it up ahead of time. But the animal couldn't see, and they kept trying to look around, and so, duh, stupid people, you know, we cut an opening and put in a plexiglass panel where they could see, and then the animals were much more comfortable, like, oh, okay, I can see what you're doing there. The juice hole is right here where the animal, once they're trained for the behavior, they can sort of take their reinforcement throughout the behavior. When you're training the behavior, obviously you want to manage when they're getting reinforced. But once the behavior is trained, we found it's really helpful to, you know, get in position, get all set up, plug the juice bottle in, and they just sit there and drink their juice. The length of the sleeve from a safety perspective for the people and for the animal should be such that the animal's at full extension. If they're in more this position, they can reach beyond the sleeve and grab you, or they could just start moving in it, which would hurt them if the needle's in their arm. The safety pin in this case, you can see here, there's a bunch of holes on the pin, or on the sleeve, so this pin could be oriented at different orientations, and that also would facilitate either arm being in the same sleeve. And some animals seem to have, you know, their vein may run in slightly different places, so it was nice to be able to adjust that. I've seen a lot of sleeves that have a static pin, and I think that it's nice to be able to have it flexible. Obviously, the needle insertion is going to be this way, so that if the animal pulls out, the needle pulls out with them. And the opening dimension should be of adequate size that allows you to see, access, feel, palpate the vein, and then actually draw blood. But you may not want it so big that the animal's arm can come out the top. Obviously, that's dangerous. This is just a baboon blood draw. The baboon is behaving splendidly, presenting his tail, staying. Unfortunately, she missed the vein. Not the animal's fault. Animal's doing a great job. Animal gets gobs and gobs of reinforcement. Person feels a bit like a jackass because she poked a hole for no reason. And again, remember, no training does not take away the pain, only takes away the fear that's associated with it. So we don't want to just go making pin cushions out of them and poking them gratuitously. So she ended up obviously taking the needle out and said, okay, well, we'll try again later. A few more sessions where the animal doesn't get poked and prodded, and then we can go back and try again. He tolerated it really well. And here's just that sleeve in use. And obviously these behaviors are working with two people. Again, one person is the trainer role, and that person is managing the animal's behavior, looking out for the overall comfort of the animal, directing the animal, directing others in the area, saying, okay, he's secure, you can move ahead. She's assisting by holding off the vein with her right hand kind of pushing down on the sleeve. And her hand, I just want to point out, she's not holding his hand against the pin. What she's doing is gently resting her hand here, and she can feel if he's starting to move, if he wants to let go, and then she can hand, and he'll reposition. So it's actually a safety measure to have her hand there. And the blood sleeve became so positive for these animals, perhaps because they get a can of Coke, that we had to train them release because they wanted to keep coming back. And like, no, I'm not letting the other guy go. I want to keep putting my hand in there. So we had to train them release and move away from it. All right, and just, I hate for us to only focus on elephants and primates and, other animals that we think might be, oh, they're smart. They can learn these behaviors. So this was shark blood draw training, just so you can see the starting point. And then where he got to actually being able to do the blood draw. And I think in this video you can see the second shark is actually waiting in line for his turn. Or her turn. And to the trainers, or the whole situation, the animal's advantage, once sharks are rolled over, they're sort of in a stupor. So it's not really necessary to do a lot of desensitization to the needle itself, but a lot of desense work went into being able to target the animals up and then begin to handle them, because they were fighting it, of course, when they first were being handled. Okay, just some more blood draw, rhino on the left, elephant on the right. Elephant blood draw from a rear leg. We want to think about safety, and one of the important safety things here is to not have your hand directly between the animal and a hard place, the hard place being the post. So his leg is extended far enough out so that the needle is between his leg and the post, but not the hand. Cats, we like to do blood draws from their tail, and honestly, in my experience, it seems like they rarely feel the needle, almost like they don't have a lot of nerve endings in their tail. Once you get the tail positioned, sort of like the shark, going through all the descent steps to just getting them comfortable with being handled, positioning their tail, either underneath like this, or sometimes we'll use a snake hook to just bring their tail out. But having them relaxed, having the tail manipulated, going through all the descent steps so that they're comfortable with their tail being touched, really the needle doesn't seem to be much of a big deal to them. I just kind of wanted to show you the positioning there. So here's a cougar also doing a blood draw. The tail's extended through an opening in the caging. Obviously one person's up at the front positioning and reinforcing the animal while the technician is in the back doing the blood draw. So other samples, semen collection. With this young male chimpanzee, we were looking at how he matured and at what age he began to have viable sperm. Measuring body temperature. Honestly, that's a bit self-reinforcing for male chimps too, or reinforcing the behavior itself. One of the chimps that we used to work, or I used to work with, when he would see the thermometer, he would get a little too excited. Please do it. He was a funny guy. Anyway, collecting weights on animals. Way back when I worked at the Houston Zoo, we didn't have a scale in place for the elephants, so we had to have Texas Department of Public Safety bring in scales, so that's what he's standing on there. But it's lovely to have built-in scales for big animals. Body measurements. The Red Panda SSP, I don't know if they still do, but they used to like to have all the youngsters measured, like measure their length and circumference or whatever, girth for growth rates, just when they were collecting data on that. Oh, I know like the lemurs, I think, are they trained to hold their tail for scale? Or is that something you want to do to
I
see
do,
how it
because
is?
right now we have to put it on top of an egg crate.
Yeah.
And they know the up and the down behavior, but as soon as they get comfortable, their tail relaxes.
And then you don't get an accurate weight.
Yeah.
And yeah, like with New World monkeys, with their prehensile tail, it's kind of a problem of them wanting to, they'll get up on the scale and sit there, but whew, that tail just naturally goes up and holds on to the mesh or whatever might be there. So sometimes having a stand or something like that can help, or some other apparatus on your scale can help with animals with those appendages that skew the accurate weight. So anyway, I think that so much of what we want to think about is being prepared, whether it's training body parts, having a good plan, organizing your individual objectives for an animal or group of animals. But everything we do, we want to try to have a plan and be prepared. And certainly that's true with veterinary, or dealing with veterinary issues. So if animals are trained to present their body parts, if they come up with an injury, then we're much better prepared to take care of those injuries, because we don't have to go, oh, he's got a hurt toe and I haven't even trained foot and toe manipulation yet, so now I have to train that on a hurt foot and then treat it, and by then maybe the injury's healed. So anything that we can do to be prepared, use these techniques to help take better care of the animals. In this case, this sea lion was getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Zoo didn't have an ultrasound machine. She was past what the normal pupping season would be. So we thought, well, we could see a baby if we took a radiograph, and she was trained for radiographs. So we took a radiograph, and about a week and a half later had that. So indeed, she was pregnant, but just slow to deliver. She was well out of pupping season. Anyway, that was probably Donna when she had salmonella. I'm not sure, one of them. All right, so we can also use our training not only to treat veterinary issues, but to facilitate certain research things, such as artificial insemination. This drill is being trained to turn around, present the rear end, and this is practicing tube insertion for AI. Obviously just a practice. I already mentioned semen collection, whether you're characterizing semen for a new species, or before unlooked at species, or like with that younger animal looking at maturation, these sorts of things. It can be kind of important basic information that maybe we don't have on an animal. We were looking at hormones with okapis and actually administering hormones to manage their reproduction. So these animals were being trained to accept an IV catheter for that. Speaking of IV catheters, this was one of the neatest chimps that I've known. His name was Perry. He's no longer with us. He was at a research facility and he had to participate in a study, a biomedical sort of study, and it involved an IV infusion. And he was already trained for blood draw. And of course the protocol for the study called for him to be anesthetized. But the trainer said, you know, he's really good with blood draw. What if we try to train him for this, for an IV infusion? And so this is the result of the training, which is just remarkable. I don't know why I'm always amazed that animals actually let us do these things to them. But this is the catheter insertion and the first time he's had an infusion. And so it's the practice leading up to the study, so it's a few cc's that are being infused. And again, he can withdraw his arm at any time. And you can see him sucking on his juice bottle. And just watch what comes out of his arm. I don't know if I'd do that for grape juice. Pretty cool guy. Okay, so this all looks super fantastic and easy, right? Got time? You can go out and do it tomorrow? Maybe a couple weeks. Well, I mean, if you look at this and think there is no way on God's green earth that we're ever going to be able to have the time to do this, does that mean you just throw up your hands and walk away? No. You can still help the animals. Think about whatever, like if you have a procedure coming up, think about that procedure. Think about all of the individual components that make up that procedure, and maybe you can break some of those components down and begin to desensitize animals to individual elements of the procedure. If you can't train the whole thing, at least make them comfortable with different parts of it. Because no behavior is just, you know, a A to B straight line training project. There are so many elements, especially of these you know, veterinary procedures that we might need to do. There's so many elements that make up that behavior. So if we can pick and choose the ones that we think might scare the animals the most or be, you know, the most intrusive for the animals, maybe we can train them for those individual parts. And desensitization is going to be, you know, probably your #1 tool. And you may want to look like if an animal has to be physically restrained, can you train them for that restraint, either in a squeeze cage or other way of restraining the animal. And if they have to be separated from their group, if they're a social animal, separation in of itself is scary. You know, I don't know if you've experienced where you train an animal, they're accepting the injection, yeah, bring it on, give me the injection all day long. And you even practiced in the morning when they have to have their sedation, right? So you're ready. And then you separate the animal the morning of the sedation. And they're like, whoa, I am not doing this now. You separated me. That's a big part to a lot of animals. So you can train separation. And I would suggest that if you're training for a knockdown and the animal has to be isolated and they're not accustomed to that, that you incorporate that into your shaping plan. But anyway, if you can separate animals and have them comfortable with separations, you may be able to get a lot better results from your practicing procedures and breaking it down into the little pieces. But training them for separations or restraint, we have lots of options of how we do that. Maybe it's something as simple as going into a crate. And that's my daughter. She's 15 now. She voluntarily enters the crate. I don't crate train my dog, but the daughter is crate trained. But anyway, restraining animals is probably one of the most stressful things that we do to them if they're not trained for restraint. And again, in my experience, animals almost seem to not even notice what you're doing to them if you're forcefully restraining them. They may not really even care because they're thinking about trying to get away. So restraint is super stressful for animals, but we can train them to accept restraint and then be cooperative with whatever procedures come after the restraint. So I'm going to stop there, and then when we pick up after lunch, we will talk a little bit about the options for restraint and kind of how you can think about breaking these things down and helping animals tolerate them better, and then we'll finish up with dealing with undesirable behavior. So enjoy your lunch. I'm going to go grab something to eat. See you at 12:30. Yeah. Number tall.
It's over in the corner.
Yeah, there you go. I'm going to throw my egg. So continuing what we were talking about with training animals for restraint. You know, there's lots of different options for restraint, and these were just kind of 3 that off the top of my head I came up with. Maybe there's others for certain species that I missed, but you know, essentially we could have a chute or a small enclosure where an animal goes into, and it just sort of limits their mobility. We may have an actual squeeze cage where we're really physically limiting anything they can do, or we may limit mobility of certain body parts. And you know, the things that I thought of were like if you're restraining an animal's head, or with elephants, you know, maybe we chain their legs, something like that. So lots of different options for chutes. Again, just kind of restrict the animal's space. Oftentimes we like a chute to be such that maybe they can't turn around, so puts them closer to the mesh if we want to give an injection or something like that. We may have a chute that gives us access on all 4 sides, like with this taper. He's fairly restrained in that chute, and the veterinarian could easily move in and take a blood sample. And of course you would want to train the animal for the desensitization, if you can, for taking the blood sample. But the step that is eliminated when you use a facility like, or a feature in a facility like this, is that you don't actually have to train the animal to move into a position. So you just sort of train them to stand there while you move in and can access them. Squeeze cages can come in different, obviously, shapes and types. This is a hydraulic squeeze for an elephant, wherein the animal would enter the space, the hydraulic door would close behind the animal here, and then the wall can, and this wall can move in like this. You may have manual restraint or squeezes where you can move the wall in. Here's just 2 different examples, again with elephants. In this case, this bar attaches up here, so it can be positioned like this where it's more of a smaller space, or it can be opened up like this where it's a bigger space. And then in this one, this wall is movable, but it has to be preset before the animal enters the space. But in any case, those options allow you to approximate the animal entering a smaller and smaller space, but you just have to preset it ahead of time. Okay, so if we're going to do things like squeeze animals up, kind of a typical little small animal squeeze that, you know, has the hand crank on it and squeaks, especially if it's rusty. You see the screw at the top, so it makes a lot of noise. Again, looking at this ocelot, look how his fur is pooching out. That's how tightly he's squeezed. And he's still taking food. So these are indicators that, you know, this animal is quite restrained because his fur and maybe a little fat bits are pooching out through the mesh, and he's still eating, which tells me he's really comfortable. This is an animal who is well trained to tolerate squeezing. Here's another individual that is quite well trained to tolerate squeezing. And I just, you know, every time, again, sort of like the needle thing, when I watch this, I think, wow, that must be so scary for an animal. You've got this big motor, world's moving in on you, but again, with proper desensitization and good technique, we can achieve pretty remarkable things with animals. If we just give them a chance to get comfortable with what we're doing, they can be successful. So in a sec, there's actually lines on these bars here. There's lines that tell you how far to move the ball in, so that's what Gina's checking there, is to see how close to move it in. Okay, and of course he's getting reinforced the whole time.
Goggles.
All right, these are examples of restricting certain body part movement. In this case with elephants, oftentimes we'll restrict their leg movement if we have to get up around and underneath them so that they can't kick. And of course this is all trained with positive reinforcement. The bird on your left, Leslie, do you leg chain birds a lot? Can y'all see the leg chain on this bird? This is the weirdest thing.
I was wondering what that picture was. I'm like,
China.
I see it.
That's in China. I work a lot in China. Yeah, they leg chain birds to a perch. I don't know. It's a very weird thing. But, I guess the other sort of thing that I was thinking when we're talking about restricting movement of body parts was jesses for birds. Really you're sort of forcefully holding that animal. Hopefully you've gone through steps in the training and they're comfortable with that physical restraint. But indeed that is physical restraint and restricting the movement of a certain body part or parts. Does anybody else have any, can you think of times where you're limiting, and something that you could train through voluntary?
Something about toweling birds. I think it was Point Pines and Maureen and Karen, they were teaching their birds that to go into the towel as a game. And so they ended up having birds they could towel because it was fun. So.
I actually thought I had a picture of that, and I didn't. I was thinking of that one too, more for like a full kind of restraint. Yeah.
Like a halter.
Oh yeah, perfect. I knew there were a lot more that I was missing. Yeah.
Yeah, we leash trained actually we're good as far as we trained the cheetahs on a leash.
Yeah, I guess any kind of leash is restricting the animal's movement somewhat. I mean, unfortunately, most of the time we use a leash as a negative reinforcer because when the animal pulls against it and then you pull back, they move to release the pressure from the leash. So, it is also that as well. Yeah, great examples. I'm gonna have to add to my picture gallery. Okay, so of course, in thinking about the things that we might need animals to enter smaller spaces, sort of going from the chute restraint idea, and thinking of that poor little gorilla that had to be anesthetized just to be stuffed in a crate. Obviously, we can train animals for entering their transport. Both of these elephants are actually chained for the transport as well because the people that were moving them required them to be additionally secured. That we might also desensitize a sea turtle to swim into a harness and then have the harness wrapped around him. And the idea is that he can then be lifted with this harness and it's got a solid piece on the bottom so his weight is fully supported. Moving tortoises. This was at the Singapore Zoo and we needed to move these giant tortoises to a new facility. And they were doing really great with their target training, but it was determined that the distance they had to travel, it might take them a day and a half to get there. So although they could probably walk from point A to point B, it didn't seem quite practical. So we instead trained them to crawl onto this cargo net, and then the cargo net they were desensitized to having it wrapped around them, and they could be transported that way. And I think when it comes to transporting animals, you always want to keep your options open, really with any kind of animal training activity, right? Like I've said, there's 100 different ways to do something. And as long as you're gaining the animal's cooperation, voluntary cooperation, you're using positive reinforcement training, the animal's welfare is protected, your safety is protected, really there's just so many options. And getting a group of people together to sort of brainstorm and think about all your different options is extremely helpful. And if you're not, if you feel that you are stuck or you're needing ideas, I really encourage you to call some of your colleagues, and particularly some of your more experienced colleagues, and, you know, sit down and just brainstorm, you know, like, oh, why didn't we put the seal in a red wagon? That would have been a great idea. You know, there's just lots and lots of options available, so. Any questions before we move on? All right, so just very briefly, I'm not going to spend time talking about this because hopefully at some point we will have another socialization discussion for those of you that haven't been exposed to it. But when we talk about using positive reinforcement to enhance socialization, you know, we have some objectives that we really want to achieve. We want to get everybody in the social group an appropriate opportunity to socialize. And of course, somebody's always going to be dominant and somebody's always going to be subordinate, and in no way, shape, or form are we trying to take that away, but instead we just want them to be comfortable within their enclosure, because of course the subordinate animal can't leave. It has to stay in the enclosure and be subjected to the dominance from the more dominant animals. But we want them to experience, you know, some measure of aggression, because that's normal, but not at super high levels. We may want to increase prosocial behavior. You know, obviously in captivity, animals are confined. They may not have the opportunity to develop normal social behavior. They may not have a normal upbringing that has enabled them to socialize properly. So with positive reinforcement, we can actually teach them these proper social behaviors. And then from a management perspective, we want to be able to access all the animals. You know, I said earlier, it's usually easy to access the dominant or bold animals, but the little shy subordinates are often hard to access, and we need to be able to check them out as well, make sure they're healthy. So I just want to review this one technique. It's only one aspect of socialization training, but it is perhaps the most important and the one that you're likely to use more than any other, and it's called cooperative feeding. Cooperative feeding was developed when working with two or multiple large intact male sea lions, and they rut during the summer. So they want nothing more than to be the boss of the guy that's sitting on the stand next to them, which doesn't really lend itself to a great show, unless you're into that kind of show. But, you know, if you're working in an oceanarium and you've got two 600-pound male sea lions that want to just go at each other, it's quite disruptive. So this technique of cooperative feeding was developed as a result of that. And in cooperative feeding, we want to increase positive social behavior and reduce aggression. We're not trying to eliminate it. We're just trying to sort of bring it down to what would be a kind of normal expected level. And in order to do this, you have to know the animal's natural history, natural behavior, and perhaps some individual behaviors about those animals that you're working directly with. And then you're going to very carefully reinforce positive social behavior. And, you know, for many animals, social behavior can be quite overt, but it can also be very subtle. You know, it may just be something as quick as an eyelid flash or a look or you know, just a little show of the tooth. So as a trainer who's trying to reinforce positive social behavior, you need to be keenly aware of what appropriate behaviors are, and also what any individual nuances might be of those animals. So when we are doing cooperative feeding, we recognize you're the dominant animal, and I'm going to pay you well for being a nice dominant animal. I am not trying to take your dominance away. I'm recognizing it and say, yes, we all know you're dominant, and we're going to work with you to make this easier so you don't have to run around beating everybody up. But that's essentially what we're going to be doing. So we reinforce dominance for allowing subdominance to have whatever is desirable, whether it's food, whether it's attention from a trainer, you know, anything that you deem as desirable. We're going to reinforce those dominants for letting the subordinates have it. And so the two behavioral changes that you will see and can generalize outside the scope of training sessions are that dominant animals become more tolerant and patient of subordinates having things, and subordinates become more relaxed and confident when they take something, because they're not getting attacked all the time. Okay, so I just want to do a little demo with you so you can kind of see how it works. here. Training area. Okay, you'll be dominant. Which is your preferred? Do you like? Okay. Excellent. She's chosen chocolate, a wise choice, I think. All right, so if I had these two food items and I wanted to give my subordinate some food, which, in order to set my subordinate up for success, which means not getting attacked by this big bully, which would I choose? Her favorite or her not favorite?
To give the subordinate?
To give the subordinate.
Or not?
Right, because it's going to be a lot easier for Leslie to tolerate Andrea taking the yucky old jelly beans compared to the delicious chocolate. So that's what I'm going to do. Let's start off. And I'm going to give her just one, a small one.
What flavor is it?
You're the subordinate, you don't get to pick. You're just happy to have anything at
So
all.
happy, give it to me.
Good girl. So she, my attention, everything is on her. I'm giving a piece of food over here. Ooh, that's a big one. Good girl. So she knows now, this is all about her. If I need to, I could bring her to a target. I could ask her to sit and stay. But it almost feels like I'm bridging the subordinate because I'm giving the food and bridging here. But really, it's your bridge. You're being wonderful for letting this happen. So this is the behavior. Okay, so that's kind of operationally how it works. Now we may start out with a very skewed, you get one tiny little yucky secondhand jelly bean, you get 3 or 4 or 5 big old pieces of chocolate. But we don't want to keep it that way because we don't want to continue giving the dominants lots and lots of food, especially if it's maybe a special treat. And you don't want to give them handfuls of chocolate every time you do the training. So at some point you need to start equalizing the value of the reinforcement. But the dominant always gets something extra and something a little bit special. So they, I mean, otherwise why would they want to keep participating? You know, you have to make it worth their while. So that's kind of how it works.
I have a question. So the lemurs, when I train them, train them fruit, and they only get 15 grams. And I tried doing that with the male, because he's the least dominant, but they get a certain type, you know, they're very everything. So I started using juice, like watered down juice, which is like really exciting. But when I get to the point where you start cutting back, and it's a juice versus a solid item, is there a difference between that, do you think? Or I just don't know where to like.
Well, since they're all getting the same foods, you sort of automatically don't have a lot of variety. Do you have to eliminate the juice, or is that something that you
No, I
can continue? Because you do need
Yeah.
something. You have to have something to
Because
get
like
the
the
dog.
more novel things are like raisins, but then I have to take one raisin and cut it into 8 pieces. So then it's like a really tiny. So I was trying to just kind of figure out how I could have a more novel to keep the dominant
Yeah.
attention. But
Yeah. I mean, if you are truly that restricted that you can't get any extra little bits of food, or you really don't have any leeway in that, then it sounds like just keeping the juice on hand would be good. Maybe you can change up the types of juice so that it remains exciting and different. Yeah. Yeah, or if you take some of their normal diet and don't cut it as small, so that then the dominant has like a big piece that you can give.
yeah.
That might be another way to do it. Okay, so let me just show you with some non-human animals. This is the first time these two Mona monkeys were cooperatively fed, and you can tell immediately who the dominant one is. He's the one chasing, so he's the one on the right. So you can hear the click. So he did a little bit of chasing, but this is the first time. So we're still gonna pay him. Pretty half-hearted. And that was really nice because he actually even looked at her take the food, which is exactly what we don't want. We don't want to hide the fact that we're giving the food to the subordinate. We want the dominant to see it happen and say, yeah, sure, I'm okay with that. Really nice. See him look again.
Or is he only okay with it because he's expecting something better? Or like expecting something in return?
Is he doing what? Because
Like, is the dominant only okay with us feeding the subordinate because he's expecting something in return?
absolutely, and he deserves it. I mean, we wouldn't try to eliminate that. You know, because if he wants to go take it, there's nothing we can do to stop him. All we can do is reinforce his choice to stay here. So we want to make sure that we continue that reinforcement and that it's worthwhile to him. I mean, if they're getting the exact same thing, he can go displace her and get hers and his. So we have to make it worth his while. He has to get something that's a little bit better. And, you know, like I said, a lot of times we start off with a fairly skewed reinforcement value for the dominant and subordinate, but then eventually we more or less equalize it, but not totally. So this is before any training. Animals are fed, they live in a big corral, and they're fed from the top. So you can see the food's tossed down. It's quite difficult to control who's getting what, because you just have to throw it in. And especially for high value items, the dominant animal, whose name is Pug, would run around and steal from everybody, so he would just come back with lots of stuff. Okay, so that's before training. This is shortly after training was started, and Pug was taught to sit and stay. This is Pug right here. He was taught to sit and stay inside, where accessing him was pretty easy, and then it was transferred out to the corral. So he's been asked to sit and stay, and I think even if you don't know a lot about chimp behavior, you can see he's a little like, I am sitting and I'm really trying hard to stay, and he's doing some scratching, which is indicative of a little nervous and anxious. I'm scooting, but I'm still staying. But everybody else gets their carrots, and he gets his carrot, and his apple is what he gets extra at the end. And this was in, I think the previous video said 91. So up until the time of Pug's death, which was just a few years ago, he was in a group. He wasn't always in this group, but he was always in a large group. He was always dominant, and he was always fed with cooperative feeding techniques, which means give you something, good boy Pug, give you something. And then at the beginning of the training, it might have been, here's for you, good boy Pug, here's yours. Here's for you and you, here's yours. But by the end of it, feed everybody else, good boy Pug, here's yours. And he would get his one apple, and by the end of the training, he actually just got a quarter of an apple. So for many years, his special thing was a quarter of an apple at every feed. So, you know, a pretty small amount of special treat, but it was still something extra that he knew he got that nobody else got. So this is when the behavior is completed. And this is Pug. So he gets a little something for sitting and staying. And look how calm everybody else is now compared to the first video, where there was just constant movement and everybody was running around and screaming a little bit. So everybody got everything. Everything they needed, even high value, they would get like yogurt cups, and everybody, even the high value foods, could be fed out this way. And again, just so you know, it's not always just for the primates. Any social animal can learn this cooperative feeding. This was the first time these giraffes were cooperatively fed. The big male kept pushing everybody else out of the way. So we targeted him, fed the female who kept pushing out of the way, and then reinforced both the more dominant female that's in the middle and the male for letting that happen. So simply by using the target to station the male and using coupled with cooperative feeding techniques, we were able to access all three of the animals relatively easy. And then similar thing with the lions. First time they've been cooperatively fed. Dominant animal is on your right. And she's just learning the training, so her bridge timing is a little bit off with the cooperative feeding part of it. She's a little late. There's also somebody working another lion to the right. So a little late on the bridge there. But she's got the idea of, it's all about you, dominant animal. forced to use English cues. All right, so that's just a really super fast overview of cooperative feeding. But there are a number of other socialization techniques that we can use. Does anybody have any animals with stereotypies or abnormal behaviors that concern you? I feel like I don't really see a lot of them here, which is
You're
awesome.
only working with the sun bears, right?
Oh, well, yeah, sun bears, of course. I forgot about them. Oh, yeah. I got it, yeah. Yeah, totally, appropriate. Well, that's, it's 100%. So training can help reduce abnormal behavior. It can help with stereotype behavior, but I will say those really ingrained stereotypies are probably the hardest thing to deal with strictly from a training perspective. But other abnormal behaviors, I guess you have a bit of swaying with the Ellies. Other abnormal behaviors can definitely be addressed with training. This was Barney, a warthog, hyper aggressive animal. Nobody even wanted to clean or take care of Barney because he was just constantly charging. He would, if you were cleaning in one stall next to the stall where he was, just bam, 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 constantly hitting the stall. Just a really aggressive, kind of disturbed animal. You just knew if he was going to break through that door at any minute and eat you. But just by starting positive reinforcement training with him, he completely changed. The training was initiated as a way to kind of assess his behavior and try to shift him without him banging and beating up the facility. It wasn't necessarily done to eliminate aggression, but his aggression completely went away. You show up with your target stick and food and he's like, me next, me next. I mean, he loved to train. This animal learned so many behaviors in a really short amount of time. So we think that he just wanted attention. He was like the kid that's screaming in the line at the grocery store and the mom's giving all kinds of attention for his rotten, naughty behavior because you're screaming at the grocery store. And of course, we all know you're reinforcing bad behavior. And that's exactly what was happening with Barney. That's all he knew to get attention was to be kind of a beast. And once it was turned around to positive reinforcement, he became quite delightful and, learned all kinds of fun behaviors, husbandry behaviors, veterinary behaviors, all kinds of stuff. Similar story with this ostrich, very aggressive animal. Started training with the animal kind of with the idea of being able to look at some wing wounds where I guess a lot of bashing against the mesh had occurred or against the chain link fence. And with some aggressive behaviors, the animal had done some damage to itself. And so a training program was initiated with the idea of being able to assess, wounding and treat it if it was necessary. But again, this animal turned out to actually really like interacting with people and turned into a great kind of rock star for an ostrich. Fairly serious stereotyped self-injurious behavior with this gorilla. She would just sit and dig big holes in her thighs with her fingers. And she had had skin grafts, been in casts to try to prevent her from picking these giant holes in her legs. I mean, all kinds of really intrusive things done to her. And so the idea was, well, she does this horrible behavior, let's start training with her for wound treatment, which is what you see there, the bottle of Mildacin, and she's presenting her thigh. But she so disliked people, so disliked people, because of all these things that have been done to her. There was no way in hell she was going to come up and let any training happen. So it was a slow process of introducing training to her, getting her comfortable with people, not even looking at her leg. I mean, if you looked at her leg, she was like, screw you, I'm out of here. So starting with hands, starting with head, ear, everything that did not pertain to her leg. And then when she was trained for leg, it was actually no big deal. She's like, oh yeah, I can do that just like I do all my other body parts. And rinsing it and cleaning the wounds was relatively easy. And she actually diminished this picking, creating these big holes in her leg, that behavior diminished pretty dramatically. In association, I mean, we can't say that it's because of the training, but it certainly happened at about the same time. And she would only revert back to that self-injurious behavior during times of extreme stress, which is, you know, kind of what you would expect to happen. So again, another unintended reduction of the abnormal behavior simply by starting positive reinforcement. So this is another chimp that I used to work with, and she had this lovely habit of stuffing things in her ears to the point where she had ruptured her eardrums, her ears were full of sticks. She just so filled her head with wood chips. And she would fabricate something that was the right size that she liked. So she would see something, she was like, oh, and then she would get it and then just start manipulating it and then shove it deep in her ear. So she ended up living in like a metabolism cage. She couldn't go outside. She couldn't have much enrichment that was of value to her. She could have, you know, the convoy, woo. She just couldn't have much of anything because she would shove anything in her ears. So since she so had the need to stuff things in her ears, we wondered if, well, one, we trained her to have her ears cleaned and try to take care of the infections this way, but it didn't really help the problem. You know, it was more of a Band-Aid on a really severe problem. So again, this was one of those, gee, can we even do this? I don't know if it'll help anything, but if she likes to stuff things into small, you know, take something and stuff it into something else, what if we train her to do it? And then would she be able to make the choice of, oh, I have this banana peel, which is what she's got in her mouth on the other side. I've got this banana peel, would I make the choice, rather than fabricating it into the perfect little things to put in my ear, which look like that, would she choose to stuff it in a receptacle? So we started this training with her, and actually it was going quite well, just over the matter of a couple of weeks. She did, like, she picked the banana peel, it's like, okay, we've got to take the big step now, we're going to give her the banana stem, which would be something she would really love to break into small pieces and stuff in her ears. We gave her the banana peel, she started to put it in the thing, and then you could just see, she was like, wait a second, I can break this up into those 3 little pieces, and they will fit beautifully in my ears. And she ended up, after she fabricated them, she actually ended up sticking them in the PVC receptacle, and we all had a big party and we thought, gee, this is really risky training. Not sure if we should do this. Her ear, I mean, the sad story is her ear infections continued to be terrible. Her quality of life was bad because she was living in this small metabolism cage. So her ears actually got sewn closed, and she went to Chip Haven, where she lives happily ever after. But now she's totally deaf, which posed some different training challenges. But, you know, it was one of those things where you sit around and brainstorm and come up with these crazy ideas, and, you know, maybe it'll work in the end, but her ear infections were so severe that she needed, you know, much more intervention than this was going to provide. So I think this is my last sort of abnormal behavior story, and then we'll move into the last topic. This is a gorilla that used to be at the Detroit Zoo. Her name's Cora, and this is actually her up top. And when she came to the zoo from another facility, she would spend all of her time sitting right here. The night holding area is down those stairs, so she would come up and sit there all day long. And it's a big exhibit, a really nice, you know, this is just a part of it. It goes off this way as well. So a really large space, and she was choosing to just stay sitting on this little concrete pad. So the group consisted of an adult male, and I think a couple, it's been so long now, I think a couple of other females. I don't think there was a younger male. And she was definitely afraid of them, but she also just sort of, is it agoraphobic when you're afraid of big spaces? She seemed a little like she would kind of come out and go, I'll just stay here, thank you. So it seemed like a little bit of fear of the other animals and also kind of fear of these wide open spaces. So we taught the other animals to sit and stay, and you can see the people are up on the rooftop. And then her behavior was slowly approximated, so the area where she would normally sit was sort of down here. And these logs were almost markers, like, okay, can you get to this point? Can you get to this point? And this is Detroit. Obviously, it's cold in the winter, so the animals are in indoor holding over the winter. And so each spring, the keepers, bless their hearts, man, they worked so hard on this. It took a couple of springs to get her trained to where she would go up to the top there. So again, this is her, so she had to come from all the way down there and up. And their patience and tenacity and dedication to helping her use the enclosure after, I'm not sure if it was at the end of the second summer or if it actually took into the third, but she actually began to not only move up to the top during training sessions, but even outside training sessions, they were seeing her starting to explore a little bit more, which is, you know, you don't want animals just doing these things during training sessions, obviously. You want them to generalize it and be comfortable at other times. Okay, so briefly, enhancing environmental enrichment programs. I think I already said training should be enriching to animals. If we want to do the check, I did cognitive enrichment today. You know, we want to make sure we're really engaging their brains and that they're thinking and learning and not just going through the routine things. If they're going through routine sorts of training, perhaps we would think of that as more social training because they're interacting with people. Training should challenge animals. You can get your sea lion helping under the hood. Hello, 1970s, once their shorts back. It's an old picture. But anyway, a little fun. All right. So we can certainly train animals to do things like use complex feeders. You know, chimpanzees are really great at using these termite-bound feeders, tubes, PVC tubes. You give them a bunch of sticks. They have to fabricate the stick, dip the stick in, and get the treats out. Well, not all chimpanzees come blessed with the brains to immediately know how to do this. So sometimes we might need to train them, and that was the case with these particular boys. They had no clue how to use this great enrichment device. So we trained them to dip the sticks in a really big mouth, big open container. You know, they could see, oh, it's full of grape jelly, and they've got a stick, and we don't quite know how to hold it in our hands yet, but they were actually trained to hold the stick and dip it into the container and smaller container until the time came where they could actually use the PVC termite feeder on their own. And the sea lion picture is the same thing. It's a puzzle feeder that when he was presented with it, he just felt frustrated because he didn't know how to get the fish out. So we had to train him how to manipulate the PVC in order to then get the fish out. So then he could use it on his own. So that's one way training can help you with your enrichment programs. Teaching animals to retrieve and trade can also be really helpful. Sometimes teaching an animal this particular behavior requires a lot of patience, and you practice, you know, leading up to the point where you're actually going to let go of the item. And just like with needle training, at some point you have to stick them. At some point you have to give them the item and hope that they're going to give it back. And you beg, please give it back. I'll reward you heavily.
Nadine, give it. Give it. Come on, right here. Gotta push it out there. Give it.
You get the sense she knows exactly what to do. Choice and control.
Give it. Give it. Nadine, give it.
But of course, when you are training this behavior, you don't want to try to snatch it from the animal because you might make them mad. So you have to get their participation in giving it back.
Give it.
And then you want to be super prepared to jackpot.
Good girl. Good girl. Bonus.
But you know, once you have a behavior like retrieve, train, you can use it to add to your exercise program instead of just doing an A to a B. Maybe fetching is more fun. If you're going to throw big tires, you want to be fairly strong and throw it so that it rolls a far distance. And you can expand a behavior like this, make it a little bit more fun, have multiple, this is a bit dark, but in this case, she had multiple objects to fetch this time. So you can add a little bit more thinking to it, I guess. Okay, if you have elephants, animals that paint, sometimes giving them choice in how they paint. Choose your colors, finger paints. So anyway, just a little bit on how we can use training to enhance enrichment programs. There's lots of other ways. I could talk about that as a topic in of its own for another hour, but I just kind of wanted to touch on a few areas there. Any questions on the undesirable or abnormal behavior or enrichment stuff? Okay, then the last topic is addressing undesirable behavior. That guy's hanging between the elephant's trunk and tusk. So picking people up like that is undesirable. And it's from a newspaper. This was at the Houston Zoo a couple of years before I started working there. He was a little drunk, got a little too close to the bull, and picked him up. He was hanging there because he's a keeper, but he was a little drunk. And he was hanging there, and we think that Ty, the elephant, thought he was dead because he was dead drunk, and then just let him go, and he was able to roll out. So rule number 1, don't be drunk at work. And rule number 2, don't get too close to the bull elephant. Anyway, it's just a fun place to start. So we have 3 techniques that we can use to eliminate or help us address undesirable behaviors. And whoops, don't shoot the dog is not one of those techniques that you probably want to use. Can you see the guns pointed at the elephant? Right here and here. That elephant, this is from a book called I Loved Rogues, and it's kind of about these it's about a guy who worked circus elephants, and he liked the nasty, difficult to work with elephants, but this used to be the fate of an elephant who was aggressive. You know, they hung elephants, they've electrocuted them, they shoot them, and in this case the elephant had killed, I think, a lady, that was at the circus. So they chained the elephant up to a fence and invited all the townspeople to come out and execute the elephant. So that's not really a good technique. That's not one of that's the shoot the dog technique. What we would rather do is use one of these 3 techniques. Extinction is one of them. Punishment in the form of a timeout is the second. And training in incompatible behavior is the third. And I'll talk about each one of those and what they are. So in order to use extinction, first off, you have to know or make your best guess as to what's reinforcing the undesirable behavior. Reinforcement does what to a behavior? It encourages, right. It makes it likely to reoccur. So if you can say, I think this is what's reinforcing that behavior, and then you withhold the reinforcement, the behavior should diminish over time. And so this is the idea behind extinction. Identify what you think is reinforcing the behavior, and then withhold that reinforcement. And it's most effective if you pair that with reinforcing the desired behavior. So you have to identify all of those things before you sort of embark on your extinction project. And I forgot to mention the extinction burst. Something that you might see during an extinction process is what's called the extinction burst. And the extinction burst is when the animal's trying really, really hard to get that reinforcement that you're so carefully withholding. And what you may see is an increase in frequency or intensity of the undesired behavior. The good news is the behavior's probably about to drop off. The bad news is if you inadvertently reinforce during the extinction burst, you've just reinforced this high intensity or frequency of the behavior. So you want to be aware of it and be on the lookout for it and sort of be extra dedicated to withholding the reinforcement during that time period. And I always like to use the example of like a chimp who throws poop at you. And the chimp throws poop at you. I keep looking at you and thinking, the chimp throws poop at you, hits you right in the ear, and it fills up your ear with nice warm poop. Been there, unpleasant. What do? Because,
Because that's reinforcing.
right, so your reaction is often really reinforcing to the animal. So when you get hit in the face with a big warm handful of poo, you have to just stand there and go, "Couldn't bother me, I'm fine." And then you can imagine the extinction burst phase is quite unpleasant with a behavior like that, when they're throwing lots of warm poo and it's filling up now both ears because you haven't been paying attention. So, but if you were to react and go, "Ah, I can't take it anymore," right when they've just been bombarding you during the extinction burst, then you've really made that chimp stay and you've reinforced that very high level of the undesirable behavior. Okay, in a perfect world, we talk about each of these extinction, training, and incompatible behavior and the use of a timeout. We talk about them as individual things, and you need to understand them and know how to use them as individuals, but in the real world, you're probably going to be doing a number of different things to address undesirable behaviors. So, in the videos, you'll see several different things happening. In this case, this elephant is new to targeting, and mostly he wants to put his head over the fence and kill the person and her target. So he comes fast, he slows down, she reinforces. So reinforcing what we want, which is a slow approach without the head over the fence. She bridged, it's hard to hear, she bridged as he was approaching before he got to the target, but just as she was about to give the food, he threw his head over. So she waited just a second, he put his head back over, desirable behavior, bridge and reinforce again. Target goes out, he's not being aggressive to it, no, he's not touching it yet, but he's approaching, bridge and reinforce. So picking out the pieces of the behavior you want to reinforce while not reacting to him throwing his head over the fence, not providing any reinforcement in the way of, you know, you jumping up and screaming, which you might think is more fun than anything. So again, he comes trunk curled, ready to charge, but then he slows down, and so that's what she reinforces. And this is really cool. You can see him look at the target, and you can almost feel him thinking about it. I see it, what am I gonna do? Do I attack it? Do I walk slowly? And he chooses to walk slowly. And that's beautiful. Great place to end that training session. Okay, so you can see there's lots of different things that are happening here. Did she kick or throw her head or something? Was I freaking out about the...
She threw her trunk.
She did throw her trunk. Okay, okay. I think I was panicking about the volume. Yep. Alright, so this elephant's behavior is to turn around with her rear end towards the trainer, both legs preferably on her side of the enclosure, not so squeezing her fat little self through. So no reinforcement, no reaction. Line her up again. She's being asked to present her side and then to turn around. Targets used to try to steady her. Trainer was a hard ass, didn't reinforce her, probably should have. And this is a behavior that, and there she gets a little aggressive. This is a behavior that's fairly well established. It's the worst elephant in the world. Okay. And then she gets a jackpot. All right, so that's kind of a combination of reinforcing the behavior that you want and trying to ignore and not reinforce the behaviors that you don't want. So the second technique we have is a timeout, and absolutely a timeout is punishment. We're trying to eliminate or reduce a behavior, And we're doing that by denying the animal the opportunity to earn positive reinforcement. So we withhold the positive reinforcement or make it clear to the animal you're cut off. Nothing is coming your way right now, no matter what you do. Okay, and a timeout can range from simply dropping your head for a moment, somehow communicating to the animal nothing is happening for you. Maybe you turn your back, maybe you walk away for a short amount of time. That you should think about the species of the animal you're working with, maybe the age of the animal, what their patience and tolerance typically is during training sessions, and make sure that the timeout is of an appropriate duration for the offense, whatever they did, and also for that particular individual. Because if you walk away for a long time, then the animal just thinks, oh well, they ended the session, and there may not be any lesson to be learned from that. So, I think it's more effective to sort of put your head down, turn your back, do something to kind of let them know, I'm still here, but you're not getting anything. I do believe there are times when a timeout is inappropriate, and those would include things like this. The animal's learning new behavior. The burden of responsibility is on me, the trainer, to help that animal be successful and learn the behavior. I'm not going to punish an animal who can't figure out what I want it to do. That's my fault. I need to take some steps back and go, hey, what can I do to help them learn? If the animal's frightened for any reason, again, you can't think and learn when you're scared. So we have techniques available to help the animal overcome fear. We want to apply those rather than punishing them for being afraid. And again, if the animal is confused or new to training, then certainly we don't want to start off by punishing them. We want to start off by making sure that they are encouraged and engaged and enjoying the training. And if they're constantly getting punished, they're not going to enjoy it. And timeouts, they certainly can be effective. Here's a very good example of an effective timeout. You'll see the misbehavior right from the beginning. Not nice. And I will say, one of the things that I would change if I was talking to this trainer is, she swung her trunk, and he stood there and said, no, Jenny, no. What are you doing? And then he turns his back. So you're still providing attention, even though you're saying, no, you're bad, blah, 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 blah. I'm still engaged with that animal. If he had just immediately turned his back, that would have been for this behavior you just did, you're cut off right then. So no additional reinforcement. So then he goes back and he's asking her to pick up the log, which is what he did prior to the trunk swing. That was the behavior that led to her trunk swing. I don't know what's happening with the video there. Sorry about that. Anyway, she gives the stick with no aggression, and is pretty well behaved. So after, following a timeout, you can choose, like if you asked an animal to do a behavior, they didn't want to do the behavior, they acted out in some way, you can choose to go back and ask for that behavior again, or you say, I don't think for whatever reason it's going to happen today, so I'm just going to skip it and go on to something else, and then kind of go back and have a positive training session. Okay, now, again, there's lots of, well, except this time with training, right? So this guy's learning to hold. And you can tell he's still learning the behavior. And he gives his hip to her. So she gives, or maybe it's this time, she's going to give a really short timeout. Just pulls the targets back, sits there. And he's trying other behaviors. But see, super short timeout. And then she goes back just to have a positive interaction. Okay, so one thing that I also just want to briefly mention is with timeouts, if you are using them, make sure they're effective. Is it having the desired result? Is that undesirable behavior diminishing, staying the same, or increasing? So sometimes we think we're giving a timeout, we think we're using punishment, but is it really having the desired result? So do a little bit of self-check if you are using timeouts. I would say my general rule of thumb is a timeout is my last choice of how to manage an animal that's misbehaving for whatever reason, because it is still punishment. Punishment still doesn't give the animal information about what to do right. All they know is they were wrong. Doesn't give them the opportunity to correct their behavior. Again, all they know is they were wrong. And it still can have those consequences of physical punishment. An animal may get aggressive, they may get frustrated, they may not want to interact with you. So make sure that your timeout is effective, make sure it's fair, make sure you're checking what you're doing. And sometimes when an animal doesn't want to do what you're asking them to do and you give a timeout, if they really don't want to do the behavior and you say, fine, I'm turning my back, you may have actually reinforced it, because now they're like, oh, all I have to do is not do that thing I don't want to do, and you go away. So you going away may actually be positive reinforcement. So just make sure you're really checking on what you're doing. And whoops. The last technique is really simple, incompatible behavior. Train the animal to do something they physically cannot do at the same time as the undesirable behavior. If you need to listen to an animal's chest with a stethoscope, you don't want them grabbing the stethoscope or your hand as you're listening. Teach them to hold on to targets. Holding on to targets is incompatible with grabbing the stethoscope. So just make sure your incompatible behavior is truly incompatible. One facility where I was working, they had an elephant that would make this sort of sound before she was going to get aggressive. And so they thought, well, what if we just put that sound on cue and then don't ask for it? Isn't that an incompatible behavior? No, then she'll just be the silent stalker. And actually, it's probably not going to do anything. I'd much rather an animal tell me when they're about to be aggressive. I don't want to punish an animal's precursors to, overt aggression. I want to listen to those. So anyway, but with an incompatible behavior, just make sure it truly is incompatible. Just another example of ultrasound training and the baboons holding on to the handholds. Okay, and that's all I have for the training introduction stuff.
Thank you.
Thank you for